initiated this debate to emphasise the severe damage that I believe would be done to the reputation of the Commonwealth, to the Zimbabwe people's struggle for democratic and human rights, and to the upholding of such rights throughout the Commonwealth if Zimbabwe were to be readmitted while its government remains in flagrant violation of the Commonwealth Charter and of the Commonwealth's 1991 Harare Declaration. Yet this is what we are told may happen following the visit of a Commonwealth delegation to Zimbabwe in November, possibly even ahead of Zimbabwe's elections due later this year. Members of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Zimbabwe, of which I declare an interest as co-chair, have all written to the Secretary-General on this matter, and I thank them for that. But we also understand that the UK government is not minded to oppose readmission because it didn't want to be seen as isolated on this issue. I understand the government's sensitivity given the UK's deeply troubled history in Zimbabwe. However, ignoring the oppression faced by the people of Zimbabwe today does not atone for past oppression inflicted under colonial rule. On the contrary, it compounds it. So I hope that rather than bowing to the pressure of others, our government is working with fellow member states to ensure that the core principles of the Commonwealth are not fundamentally undermined by Zimbabwe's readmission, while being clear that if necessary, the UK will stand in defence of those principles, even if it has to do so alone. At the conclusion of the Commonwealth visit, the Secretariat issued the following statement. Zimbabwe has made significant progress in its journey to rejoin the Commonwealth family. This mission by the Commonwealth forms part of the broader membership process, and we look forward to advancing this further. It's not clear what progress they had in mind, as little further detail was provided to support this assertion, but all the evidence from independent observers point to the opposite conclusion. The Commonwealth statement was particularly puzzling as the Harare Declaration is unambiguous in asserting the Commonwealth's belief in the liberty of the individual under the law, in equal rights for all citizens regardless of gender, race, colour, creed or political belief, and in the individual's inalienable right to participate by means of free and democratic political processes in framing the society in which he or she lives. My Lord, Zimbabwe's paramilitary regime believes in none of those things, and it is currently in breach of every single one of the principles of the Commonwealth Charter that relate to them. Far from making progress towards these principles, levels of repression are ramping up as elections approach. Just 13 days after the conclusion of the Commonwealth visit, a joint meeting of the APPG Zimbabwe and the Parliamentary Human Rights Group heard in-person testimony from a young Zimbabwean activist, Netsai Marova, who was arrested in May 2020 for taking part in a protest, along with fellow opposition activist Cecilia Chimbiri and opposition Member of Parliament Joanna Mamombe. They were taken to Harare Central Police Station, from which they were abducted and then subject to torture and sexual assault, an ordeal that lasted over 36 hours. I defy anyone to hear Netsai Marova's harrowing testimony and to continue to argue for Zimbabwe's return to the Commonwealth while such abuses take place. While recovering in hospital, Netsai and her colleagues were charged with taking part in an illegal protest and later with faking their own abduction and making false allegations of sexual assault and torture. On the 10th of June 2020, 5 UN Special Procedures experts of the UN Human Rights Council issued a statement calling on the Zimbabwe authorities to urgently prosecute and punish the perpetrators of this outrageous crime and to immediately enforce a policy of zero tolerance for abductions and torture throughout the country to ensure the effective protection of women against sexual violence and to bring those responsible to account. They also expressed grave alarm over concerns this was not an isolated instance, reporting that in 2019 alone, 49 cases of abductions and torture were reported in Zimbabwe without investigations leading to perpetrators being held to account. 2 years on, Joanna Mamombe and Cecilia Chimbiri continue to be harassed through the courts on these charges despite their evident lack of merit. Netsai Marova managed to escape from Zimbabwe and was granted a scholarship by the Norwegian government under their Students at Risk programme. Her life and those of her colleagues have been upended by the actions of the Zimbabwe state, and they remain severely traumatized. On the 1st of December last year, another youth activist and former leader of the Zimbabwe National Students' Union, Makomborere Harazavishi, spoke at an event in South Africa House hosted by Action for Southern Africa, formerly the anti-apartheid movement. He laid out the gross abuse of human and political rights being perpetrated by the Zimbabwe regime and the need for the world to speak out against them. Mr. Harazavishi, who hopefully will be with us a little later in this debate, unfortunately his train has been delayed, has been arrested 37 times over the past decade and was detained without trial for nearly 11 months in Chikurubi Maximum Security Prison. In March last year, parliamentary by-elections saw widespread violence unleashed against opposition campaigners across Zimbabwe. Open incitement to violence in a speech by Vice President Chiwenga at a rally in Kwekwe led the next day to an attack by ZANU-PF thugs on an opposition rally in the same city, leaving one opposition supporter dead and many more injured. Every day, democratic space is closed down further. On December the 23rd, the regime gazetted the so-called Patriotic Bill, which grants extraordinary repressive powers under the guise of defence of sovereignty and imposes sentences of 10 years on those who expose the nature of the regime to international audiences while stripping them of their rights to vote or stand in election. The same month, the draconian Private Voluntary Organisations Amendment Bill, representing an all-out assault on civil society in direct contravention of Article 16 of the Commonwealth Charter, passed in the lower house of the Zimbabwe Parliament. The new law allows the regime to designate NGOs as high risk, thereby allowing them to revoke their registration and remove or replace their leadership. Meanwhile, the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission continues to be packed with ZANU-PF supporters, including, extraordinarily, the daughter of former Vice President Kembo Mohadi. ZEC continues to refuse to provide access to the full voters' roll, while opposition rallies are regularly banned and political repression only increases. Only this weekend, footage emerged of brutal beating of elderly people in villages for having attended opposition meetings. And as we participate in this debate, the opposition's deputy chairperson, Job Sikala MP, languishes in Chikurubi Maximum Security Prison, where he has been held without trial since his arrest in June. At the time, Mr. Sikala was acting as lawyer for the family of murdered activist More Blessing Ali. Her brother, Washington, to whom we offer our sincere condolences, will also join us later. In response to Mr. Sikala's detention, the Governing Council of the Interparliamentary Union stated on October the 22nd last year that it fails to understand how his detention in a maximum security prison could possibly be justified, is alarmed by allegations that Mr. Sikala is being held in inhumane conditions, and fails to understand the factual basis for the arrest of Mr. Sikala. My Lords, it is now clear beyond doubt that the Zimbabwe government is intent on using violence, intimidation, and the full power of the state to crush all opposition ahead of this year's scheduled general elections. I therefore urge our government and all member states of the Commonwealth to make clear that Zimbabwe will only be readmitted to the Commonwealth when all political prisoners are released, prosecutorial harassment of the opposition ceases, and the rule of law, the Constitution of Zimbabwe, and the principles of the Commonwealth Charter and the Harare Declaration are upheld. In a powerful letter written to his fellow Zimbabweans from prison this month, Mr. Sikala says this: "I understand you might be outside and I am inside, but our suffering and our pain is the same. We are all under attack. If I am killed, I am prepared to meet the fate in defence of values and principles I hold dearly, values of a free and open democratic society, exuding happiness, free of impunity and fear. What I know is that the world will not allow you to perish on your own, dearest Zimbabweans. All outposts of democracy shall speak in defence of our people under siege." That is Mr. Sikala's hope and his faith. It remains to be seen if our government and those of other Commonwealth member states will live up to it. If we do not, a clear signal will be sent to the vicious Zimbabwe regime that they can continue to violate the democratic and human rights of their citizens with impunity. In such circumstances, the responsibility for subsequent events will lie heavily upon our shoulders and those of every member state which chose to stand aside rather than to stand up for the principles of the Commonwealth and the rights of its citizens. My Lords, I beg to move.
My Lords, I'd like to draw attention to the entry in the Register of Members' Interests in my capacity as Deputy Chairman of the Commonwealth Enterprise and Investment Council. And I'd like to thank the noble Lord Oates, for introducing this topic. He paints a fairly bleak picture of what's going on in Zimbabwe and raises some astonishingly serious points. I would just suggest that they are slightly at odds with the finding from the most recent visit of the
UPG. And I'd also like to thank other noble lords for their insightful contributions. The United Kingdom would like nothing more than to see Zimbabwe rejoin the Commonwealth. As my lords are aware, that is a collective decision for all members to make. If the Secretary-General makes a formal recommendation that Zimbabwe has met the criteria and is ready to be admitted or readmitted. The 1991 Harare Declaration and the 2012 Commonwealth Charter were landmark moments that redefined the Commonwealth and cemented its place as a modern, forward-looking organisation. The core principles of freedom and democracy, peace and prosperity, are as important now as they were then, and they remain the basis for assessing any application to join or rejoin this family of nations. The United Kingdom is committed to maintaining a constructive dialogue with the government of Zimbabwe, including on the principles underpinning the Harare Declaration. The former Minister for Africa held frank discussions on many of these issues with Zimbabwean Foreign Minister Shava last summer. And during his visit to Harare in November, Professor Luis Franceschi, the Commonwealth Secretariat's Assistant Secretary-General, a meeting which has been mentioned a couple of times during this debate, he met with a range of stakeholders from government, opposition parties, civil society groups and diplomatic missions. And this included a meeting with our own ambassador to Zimbabwe, as well as a meeting with all Commonwealth ambassadors to Zimbabwe. And discussion focused on the evidence of progress against the Harare Declaration principles. And some areas of progress were noted, particularly on economic reforms, but equally concerns were also raised about instances of political violence, harassment, and detention of opposition activists and efforts by the government to restrict the freedom of civil society to operate. And but to reassure Noble Lord Lumba that we too would like to see the government of Zimbabwe meet its international and domestic obligations by respecting the rule of law, safeguarding human rights, delivering genuine political and economic reform for all, obligations that are clearly articulated in the Harare Declaration and Commonwealth Charter, because all of that as a package is the precondition for membership of whether new or renewed, to the Commonwealth. And we'll wait to see the Secretary-General's assessment, and we will see it, although as I understand it, it's not a public document, but I will get back to the Noble Baroness on that if I'm wrong. But we will see the assessment, and we'll be able to see her views of progress or otherwise against the Harare Declaration principles and her subsequent recommendation following the mission by the Secretariat last November. As the Noble Lord Lyon said, and in fact it's a point that's been made by a number of speakers today, the general elections expected this year present really the ideal opportunity for the government of Zimbabwe to demonstrate progress against the principles of the Charter, namely respect for human rights, freedom for the political opposition, civil society, and media to operate. And Noble Baroness Hoey made this point very clearly. She referred to some of the rumours in her speech of when submissions might be made. But I would like to reiterate on behalf of the UK government that we really do see the general election as the moment for the Zimbabwean government to prove, to demonstrate its readiness to rejoin the Commonwealth. It just seems to be the most obvious moment for that signal to be sent by the government. And of course the UK doesn't support any particular candidate or any particular political party in Zimbabwe. We'll continue to engage with all parties across the political spectrum. As noble lords would expect, it's for the people of Zimbabwe alone to choose their president and their members of parliament. And it is essential that this choice is exercised through peaceful, credible and inclusive elections in line with Zimbabwe's own constitution. And we'll therefore continue to encourage the government to implement the recommendations of the 2018 electoral observation missions ahead of the 2023 elections. Now, unfortunately, we note, as others have, that there has only been limited progress on most of the recommended reforms to date. Of particular importance are the independence of the Electoral Commission, an accessible voter registration process, publication of an accurate voter's roll, transparent use of state-owned resources, transparent and accountable result tallying process, and equal access to state-owned media for all participating political parties. My Lords, will also continue to encourage the government of Zimbabwe to allow space for the opposition and their supporters to... Yes, please.
In relation to the upcoming general election. And Lord Leon referred to the Commonwealth observers at the last election, of which I was one. I was party to the report that was prepared on that occasion. Can I just ask my noble friend, given the very positive comments he made about the importance of the 2023 election, that message is given to all members of the Commonwealth so that they understand the judgment, which I think most of us would share, that no decision could be made before the general election and before observers' reports are published.
My Lords, as I said, we continue to encourage the government to make space for opposition candidates and their supporters to campaign without fear of violence, for civil society organisation journalists to operate without harassment in line with the country's own constitution. And as I said in this House last October, the UK has observed a trend of lengthy pre-trial detention of government critics in Zimbabwe, and a number of examples have been cited already in this debate. And while most of the opposition members arrested in Nyatsimai in June have now been granted bail, members have raised the specific case of Job Sikala, MP, and we are continuing to monitor his ongoing detention. And in response to a point made by the Noble Lord Oates, we, of course, remain concerned by the failure of the government to address allegations of abduction and abuse of 3 opposition members that he named, Joanna Mamobe, Cecilia Chimbiri, and Netsai Marova. We've raised our concerns with the government, and we've publicly called for an investigation into the allegations. And we're also concerned by the trend of lengthy pre-trial detention for government critics in that country. We regularly call for due legal process to be followed and for human rights, including those of prisoners, to be safeguarded. And noble lords will be very aware of the case of Makumborero Haruzi Fishe, apologies for the appalling pronunciation, I'm sure, an opposition activist who I understand is here with us today. And I welcome him to this House. And spent 11 months, as noble lords know, detained without trial in Chikurubi maximum security prison. And his case, as noble lords know, is far from unique. And I actually will take this opportunity, not least because we have Washington here with us as well, to echo the condolences that were passed by our ambassador to Zimbabwe publicly to More Blessings family, More Blessing Ali's family, and friends. And we called, as our ambassador called, for those behind that terrible crime to be brought to justice. I also highlight a concern at the violent incidents around by-elections in Zimbabwe last autumn. We urge all political parties to refrain from violence and adopt measured language which will support peaceful campaigning. Any incidents of violence should, of course, be investigated in full. My Lord, Zimbabwe must allow space for civil society organisations to operate properly and fully in the run-up to the general election. And Noble Lord Collins, in his remarks mentioned the Private Voluntary Organisations Amendment Bill. And like him, our view is that if passed into law and implemented, as it hasn't quite yet been, it does have the capacity, of course, to seriously undermine this principle and prevent civil society from delivering critical development and humanitarian assistance across Zimbabwe. Noble Lord Oates raised the question of how the UK will work with other Commonwealth nations on Zimbabwe's application to rejoin them. And, my lords, the UK, with our international partners, is committed to supporting Zimbabwe to make progress on reforms. We've deep and long-standing partnerships with many member states, and we engage and consult widely on all issues of importance to the Commonwealth. For example, UK ministers and officials speak on a very regular basis to their South African counterparts, most notably at the recent South Africa state visit to the UK, on a very broad range of issues, including Zimbabwe. And I assure Noble Lords that we will continue to engage constructively, openly, robustly with all relevant parties in the lead up to this year's elections. Noble Lord Purvis raised the issue of sanctions applied by the UK, and our sanctions, as he said, target, well, I think he said 4, but our sanctions target 5 individuals responsible for some of Zimbabwe's worst human rights and corruption violations. But I just want to make clear that those sanctions are not targeted at, and they very much seek to avoid impact on the wider economy and the people of Zimbabwe. And they're not the cause of Zimbabwe's economic problems. In order to lift the sanctions, the UK really needs to see reasonable progress on political reforms and human rights. The Noble Lord Swire touched on the issue of ODA, in particular the issue of pensions, and I'll just say that the UK regularly underlines to the government of Zimbabwe the importance of fulfilling their responsibilities to all those entitled to a Zimbabwe government pension, including former Southern Rhodesian civil servants. The ambassador wrote to the Minister of Finance on the 30th of May 22 on this issue, and the government of Zimbabwe has assured us that it will resume payments when the economic situation allows. That the Commonwealth Veterans Fund has been in receipt, which he mentioned, I think, in his speech, has been in receipt of £430,000 last year. And I'm told that has provided direct support to 470 veterans. And we'll continue to support the most vulnerable people in Zimbabwe through our broader aid program. This financial year, we provided £101 million, mostly focused